So I am here to kind of talk about a couple of things. Actually two things in particular. One is kind of who I am and how I ended up getting here. Because I think that as people who are interested in the brain and the biology of the brain, there's many different ways you can use the stuff you're learning here. And I'm going to kind of present one version of that in sort of my development as a scientist and as a physician. I happen to be both an MD and a PhD, and I'm a researcher and a psychiatrist as well, and so I can tell you about that. And then I can also, along the way, kind of tell you about the research that I've done, throughout my life, the research on the brain, and it's been one of the great pleasures of my life to be able to study this subject. And I have to say that it really is because of this class that you're all taking now that I actually got interested in this stuff in the first place. So I hope that, some of you, will be similarly inspired by this, because it's a fascinating subject. It's a difficult subject, right? I mean, this is not an easy class, if I recall, but it's something that if you're interested in it and you work hard, you can really get a lot out of it. Perhaps some of you find it to be an easy class. I don't know. It's something that when I took it, it was the first year I think that had been offered here, and it really struck me as something that had a lot of meaning all of a sudden. I was always interested in science and biology, and I took AP biology here, but this class, I started learning about things like mental illnesses and things like schizophrenia. I still remember the picture of the schizophrenic brain and how the hippocampus was smaller in that brain, and we saw it in this class, and that was really interesting because this is not just about biology, this is about human experience, right? And so we all have minds, we all think, we all feel, we all remember things, and I think that it's really cool to think about how that is all rooted in something that's going on in this organ we call a brain. And so that's really one of the things that sort of struck me, was that there's something philosophical about this too. It's not just a biological set of questions. So you're all seniors now, is that right? Okay, and so you're all like heading into college like very soon. So you're all pretty checked out, I guess. Is that okay? I'll keep that in mind. Well, congratulations to you all. I presume are in order, and that's very exciting. And how many of you have an idea of like what you're interested in doing, or is anybody interested in? Okay, great. So is anybody? You in the back? What are you kind of headed into? Engineering. What's your name again? Jason. Jason. Okay, engineering. Okay, and then somebody else. You had raised your hand. What's your name?
Agriculture and diesel technology.
Excellent. All right. All right. So we have people interested in machines here. Okay, very good. And anybody else interested?
Gotta get pumped.
All right, good. So, anybody have any interest in medicine, or you do?
I want to be a pediatric oncologist.
Okay.
Athletic training.
What was that? I'm sorry.
Athletic training.
Athletic training. Great. Okay.
I'd like to study biochemistry.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Anybody else interested in sciences in general? Okay. Okay, good, good. Well, that's a good place to be, yeah.
An obstetrician.
Obstetrician, okay. Oh, do you want to explain it?
Gives birth to babies. Delivers babies.
Right. Yeah, so that's very exciting, So I can talk a little bit about what it's like to become both a scientist and also a physician, right? So there's some people interested in sort of some part of that, and some people interested in other parts. I've done both, and so it's a long road, and it's a lot of fun. Medicine is something that is it's really a calling, and I think it's great to see you all excited about that. It's something that I got interested in even before I think even before I was born. Somehow it seems my father is a doctor. He still practices internal medicine. He was one of the local doctors here actually when I was in school, and so he really got me interested in medicine in the first place, and then it was really through school that got channeled into sort of thinking about biology and science. And so, after I left here from in 1990, I went to NYU, or New York University, when it was much easier to get in there than it seems to be now. And I studied neuroscience there, actually. So it was actually one of the few universities or colleges in the country that actually had a neuroscience major. And just like actually when I came here, this was like the first year that they offered the class here. My class was among the first classes that had a neuroscience undergraduate major. And it was really because of this class that I was so interested in neuroscience and went there and pursued that. So that involved studying, neuroscience is a broad field, as you all probably are aware by now. You can study things from, how do individual neurons from the spinal, the neural tube of a fruit fly extend into its limbs and pattern themselves, and what are the molecular signals that are involved in that, to how do we understand how consciousness works and how memories work, and how do we understand how addictions work. Addictions is an area that I've been interested in for some time, and that's something that can be understood at many different levels. So that's one of the interesting things about neuroscience, I think, is that you can look at a phenomenon at many different levels. There's the level of behavior, there's a level of sort of large scale systems, like this brain area connects to this brain area and it does this, down to the sort of cellular level where different cells are talking to each other through synapses, and there's different molecules that are involved in that kind of communication. So it kind of hones down into whatever level of thinking you're really interested in. In college, I got really initially interested in the sort of cellular and molecular side of things, and so I did a research project there. My undergraduate thesis was looking at how synapses in the developing visual system form, and so I used techniques like it's called immunocytochemistry, where I would take antibodies and I would stain tissues with them, and then I would look at them under the microscope in the visual system and see, well, where do these types of receptors go in development? Do they stay in the same place? Do they cluster at synapses that are functioning? And so I combined that with electron microscopy, and I did a project looking at that. That was interesting. It got me sort of interested in the process of research. And I also I was a pre-med in college, so if you want to study medicine in college, the minimum that you have to do is that you have to take 4 classes. So you have to take biology, which you have to take chemistry, organic chemistry, and physics. Okay, and so you have to take 2 semesters of each one of these, each one with some laboratory component as well. Along with that, you have to take what's called the Medical College Admission Test, or the MCAT. Many of you probably heard of this, and this is the test where basically they take all that knowledge that you learned over those 4 classes and they see how much you remember, basically. And so that's really all you have to do to get into medical school. You can study anything you want. You can study dance, you can study literature, or you can study neuroscience. And so it helps also to have some research experience when you're an undergraduate, to go into medical school, also to do volunteer work, to work in hospitals, nursing homes, to kind of get your own experience working with people, especially people who have medical needs, and sort of to get a sense that this is something, because medicine is about both kind of the science part of it, but it's also about working with people and trying to help them in a particular way that doctors do. So that is all quite a bit of work, and in college, you spend a lot of time in the library studying. I had a little bit of fun too in college, so, well, you have to be there most nights, I think, and it's so it is definitely a lengthy process to go through. So after college, I decided, actually, I sort of got so enamored with research that I thought, well, maybe I want to actually do that alone. I had become a little bit ambivalent about medicine. I became really interested in research, and so I took a job working at the Rockefeller University, which is it's actually a biological sciences research institute in Manhattan. where there are a lot of Nobel Prize winners and people like that who do a lot of interesting research. I happened to get a job working in a laboratory that studied birds and studied how birds sing and how they communicate with each other. And this was a lab where we were interested in things like there are certain parts of the brain that hear another bird's song, that decode that into, well, this is another bird's song that's related to me, or this is a male song versus a female song, and then I have to respond to that appropriately. If I'm a male bird and there's another male bird singing, I'm going to announce myself as a male bird, versus if I hear a female bird, I'm going to say, you know what, I'm interested in mating with you. So there's a whole set of social questions and interesting questions about behavior that we were looking at using techniques like electrophysiology, right, where we would take very tiny little electrodes and sneak them into the bird's brain while the bird was alive and sometimes even awake, and we would record activity of those neurons while the bird was listening to different stimuli. Now, some people find this to be a little bit disturbing, right? As you probably have all become aware of through this class, a component of brain research involves working with animals. Now, you can do it without working with animals too. So if that's something that turns you off, there is a path into neuroscience that doesn't involve working with animals, which I'll get into later. So I did some of that work, which we would call more of a systems level approach, where I was looking at different brain systems in the bird brain and understanding how those related to the behavior. So the activity of neurons in the bird brain, or if we cut out a part of the bird's brain, how does it affect the bird's behavior? We also would inject dyes into parts of the bird's brain that would travel from one part of the brain to another part of the brain to see how connections were formed in the brain, and so how the brain was essentially wired up. And we would use we again used a lot of microscopes, and there were a lot of pretty pictures that we got from those kinds of studies. Now, around this time was when I became interested in the question of addiction, and that's probably something else that you guys have learned. I notice here actually that you guys are this is from your class here? So this is very interesting. I mean, you guys, I think, have done a great job kind of characterizing what some of the physiological aspects of addiction are. And so I became interested in addiction while I was working with birds, not because the birds were addicted, because that was a time in my life when basically I was out of school and I was able to sort of see around me and see and appreciate some of the problems in society. As you're probably aware, addiction is a big problem. It's not only a problem for individuals, but it's a problem for society as a whole. Not only because it's bad and because you shouldn't do it and things like that, but because it is associated with a lot of health problems, right? So tobacco, alcohol, liver disease, lung disease, heart disease, all of these things are related to that. But in terms of mental health and people's ability to have stable relationships, and there's a whole sort of socioeconomic aspect of addiction. It was quite an interesting subject apart from its biology. And so I became interested in it for a variety of reasons, and it sort of clicked in my mind that, you can actually study addiction at the level of the brain. And so I started to read a little bit about addiction neuroscience and learned about this whole idea of the reward system and some of the neurobiology of addiction. Have you guys had a chance to sort of learn a little bit about that? About dopamine and the nucleus accumbens and things like that? So that whole, you guys are pretty sophisticated here, it looks like. That's great. So that whole system was something that was very interesting to me, because it's really unique in some sense among psychiatric disorders. And we do consider addiction at this point to be a psychiatric illness, that it has a very clear kind of neurobiological basis, unlike schizophrenia or depression or anxiety, which it's hard to get like a rat to have schizophrenia, or to get a hamster to become depressed, right? But addiction is something that you can get a fruit fly addicted on alcohol or nicotine, or you can get a rat addicted to cocaine. And what that allows you to do is to then, right, it's interesting, right? So it's not just something that people undergo. So it speaks to the very deeply kind of biological nature of addiction, and it's a very clear example of where there's a sort of what we call a neural substrate for a set of complex behaviors, right? This self-administration that these animals are doing, this compulsive, even in the face of negative consequences, and that looks a lot like human addiction, right? And so that was very captivating to me. And here I was studying the birds, and I was learning a set of techniques that actually you could have translate wholesale into the study of addiction. Around this time, I read a book, which was really kind of a seminal experience for me. And I recommend this book for you all because it's a very interesting book. It's pretty accessible. And it's quite an interesting book. It was called Descartes' Error. I'll write it down for you all because it really was an interesting one. This was written by this guy, Antonio Damasio, and he was at the University of Iowa at the time. And this book basically, it wasn't really about Descartes or his error, but it was really about understanding how people make decisions, right? We make decisions all the time. Should I eat this or shouldn't I eat this? Will I get fat if I eat it? Well, if I don't, then I'll be hungry. Should I smoke the cigarette? Well, it'll be really nice if I do it, but, 10 years down the road, I may get heart disease and I may die. Should I date this person? They're really attractive, but you know what? My friends think that, he's kind of a dork, and so, okay, fine. Do people still use that word? I guess it's probably quite out. Anyway, so these are all decisions, right? Important decisions in the social, the moral, the financial domains, okay, and also decisions that involve basic biological functions like eating, sex, thirst, these kinds of things, and as it happens, addiction. They all involve some element of pleasure or punishment, right? Something is going to feel good, but there's a consequence, a negative consequence that comes usually down the road at some later point in time. And the consequences are often uncertain, right? Well, if I smoke this cigarette, it'll feel good, and I may get lung cancer, but then again, I may not, right? And so how do I think about that? Because if I knew 100% that I was going to get lung cancer if I smoked the cigarette, it would be kind of a no-brainer, so to speak, right? But if I'm not so sure about it, then it's easier for me to kind of do that. And so Damasio, in his book Descartes' Error, talked about the general process by which people make decisions that involve uncertain reward and punishment. So he studied this guy named Phineas Gage. Have you guys talked about Phineas Gage here? So Phineas Gage was, just to put it briefly, he was a guy who worked on the railroad, and he was, tamping dynamite, and the guy who helps him tamp the dynamite didn't put the cotton swab in there, and so basically it sparked the gunpowder, and it shot the tamping rod through his brain. And it shot it up through, I think, his orbit here, and it passed right up through, and it destroyed a part of his brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, right? And so this part of the brain is, we'll just call it the PFC, is basically, if you look at the brain here, let me see if I can do a good drawing here, is this part of the brain that sits kind of right here, and this is the sort of, if you look at it as the kind of the if you cut the brain in half like that, and you look at the middle of the brain, it sort of sits right here. It's ventral, which means it's the bottom of the brain, and it's medial, which means it sits in the middle of the brain. And that part of the brain, plus a bunch of other parts, basically ended up getting destroyed by this accident. Now this guy, before the accident, he was an upstanding citizen, he was a good husband, he was a productive worker, and he got along well with other people. And this happened to him, and all of a sudden, he woke up, and it wasn't that he couldn't recognize people, or that he forgot who he was, or that he, forgot how to do math problems or anything like that. He just had this change in his personality, right? Where all of a sudden, he became mean to people, he became irresponsible at work, he started cheating on his wife. All these things started happening to him that reflected almost like a change in his ability to make judgments, okay? And so this was observed back, and this happened like in the early or mid-1800s, and this happened back then. It was described, the behavior changes were described, but nobody really knew why or what part of the brain was involved. So Damasio, along with his wife, they took the skull that was in some museum, and they reconstructed it, and they found out that it was this part of the brain that was damaged. And in doing so, they then said, well, then what does this part of the brain do? And what they did was they then took a bunch of people who were alive now, who had damage in this part of the brain from strokes and other things, and they said, well, let's bring them into the laboratory, right? And let's study what they can and cannot do. And lo and behold, many of those patients had the same kind of personality changes that this guy had, right? And so this is one approach in neuroscience, is to study how large-scale, kind of what we might call focal brain damage in one particular part of the brain, right, not the whole brain, but just this particular part, leads to some measurable change in human behavior. And this is an approach called the lesion method, okay? It's relating changes in behavior to alterations in particular areas of the brain through some kind of pathology, through some kind of stroke or trauma or what have you. And so lo and behold, there was some very specific set of problems that these people had. Again, they didn't have problems doing math or memory problems or remembering locations in space or things like that. They had specific problems in making certain kinds of decisions. And so my advisor devised a kind of a card game, right, where they looked at basically making decisions about, essentially that involved, that required people to make decisions about reward and punishment based on sort of uncertain rules. And these patients really did very poorly on that. And so that was a finding that was kind of groundbreaking at the time. And there was a theory behind it, which is that the problems that these people have is not that they can't make decisions, right? Because there's certain decisions that they can make, right? They know that if the light is red, they shouldn't go through the red light, okay? Because it's obvious, that's the rule, right? But they have problems in the specific kinds of decisions, and again, that involve uncertain reward and punishment. And so my immediate advisor, who is this guy named Antoine Bishara, so I should rewind a little bit. So this was around the time that I was studying the birds, that I read this book with this guy who was at the University of Iowa. After reading it, I said, wow, that's what I really want to do. I want to go and be like him and study people with brain damage, okay? And so what I decided to do, and I was also realized that I can combine my interest in science with my interest in medicine, right? So that's what led me to the path of doing an MD and a PhD. So for those who are interested in science careers and medicine, there is a particular path that some people take. It's a combined degree, which is what I did, where you go into a program and you get an MD and a PhD at the same time. It takes at the minimum about 7 years to do it. Usually, an MD alone takes 4 years, and a PhD sometimes takes 4 or 5 years by itself. The combined degree is a little bit less time, but it sort of combines elements of both things, and you graduate with both degrees. And so that's what I did. I decided to uproot myself, I should say, and travel from New York to Iowa City, where I went and then worked with Antonio Damasio and Antoine Bishara. And I became interested in trying to apply this model of how people make decisions to studying drug addiction, because that's a kind of a decision that certain people make. And also using this scientific approach, which involves studying how focal brain damage affects behavior, right? So I became interested in this. In addition to studying this part of the brain here, right, Damasio was also interested in studying a part of the brain. If we're looking now at the side of the brain here, it's a part of the brain called the insula. And he was interested in this part of the brain because it has a lot to do with how people feel emotions, right? So everybody knows what it's like to feel an emotion. There's an actual brain process behind that. And the theory goes that when people see something like they see, some sort of scary thing like a bear, let's say, okay, that this part of the brain here, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, gets that information and it sends out information to the body, right? So you all know that when you're scared or you're angry or you're happy or you're sad, that's associated with things like increases in your heart rate, your blood pressure. You feel kind of like your body is kind of perked up when you're feeling these emotions. Well, the theory goes that those changes are actually, once they happen in the body, when you have something emotional happen, they then feed back into the brain, okay? And that feedback is actually how you feel an emotion. That an emotion is really the registering of these bodily changes in areas like the insula, okay? So the insula is a part of the brain that gets information from the body and it makes it available to your conscious experience, right? So all the things that happen in your guts, your lungs, your heart, your blood vessels, your digestive system, they have, you actually can perceive those things and they contribute to how you feel. And so this insula is a part of the brain that helps you taste things, it helps you experience pain, it helps you to experience pleasurable things as well that arise from your body. And so you can see how it may actually play a role in addiction, right? So now, at the same time that Damasio became interested in this part of the brain called the insula for its role in how people feel emotions, there was a whole set of research that was being undertaken by people like Nora Volkov. Have any of you heard this name before? She is the director of the National Institutes of Drug Abuse, right? So this is the part of the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH. It's that part of that organization that looks at the scientific basis of drug addiction, right? And also they study drug policy, and they study different aspects of the economics of drugs and the legal aspects of drugs. And so she oversees this whole thing, but she's also a neuroscientist. She's also an MD and also a psychiatrist who has both a scientific role and a major administrative role in the US government in terms of studying drugs, right, and drugs of abuse. And so her research actually looked at what we call cue-induced craving, okay? So what this is that people who are addicted to things like cocaine, alcohol, nicotine, heroin, things like that, they're not always looking for drugs, okay? They may be, they have been treated for the drugs, they got detox, they've been out of the drug for a year, and they'll be hanging out and at somebody's house and somebody will light up a cigarette, right? And they were fine up until that moment, but at that moment something happened where they saw that person light up a cigarette, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, I really want a cigarette. I can't stop. I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop feeling this craving, right? So there's a craving that was elicited by a set of cues in the environment, right? It's kind of like, if you're you're hungry and you walk into a room and you smell pizza and all of a sudden you feel hungrier, right? It's not that like your glucose level all of a sudden went down in your body. Something is happening that's some sort of dialogue between your brain and your body that's triggered by that stimulus. And that looks a lot like this process here. So you take out bear and you put in cigarette here, right? And then you have a similar process. And what she found was that, in fact, when you use functional brain imaging, have you guys talked about functional brain imaging? Yes?
Well, yeah, they know about taking pictures of the brain.
Okay, so this is basically where you put people into a brain scanner. You can use functional MRI, you can use PET, you can also use something called magnetoencephalography, but she was using this technique. So what this does is it takes people, you put them into the scanner, you inject them with radioactive water or glucose, which then goes to where the activity is in the brain, right? So you take pictures with a camera, and it sort of lights up the parts of the brain that seem to be activated by certain stimuli. And so what she did is she put people into the PET scanner, she showed them these cues, and she found that there was activity in this part of the brain here and this part of the brain here. This part of the brain seems to come up a lot, take it easy, in these kinds of studies. Now, people were talking a lot about this part of the brain here, okay, as being important for addiction. And I was interested in this, but then nobody was really talking about this part of the brain here, the insula, right? It didn't seem to really register with people. And I was interested in it again because of this interesting theory about the body and about what the work Damasio was doing. And it kept on coming up again and again and again in these studies. And so I had an idea, I had a hypothesis, and this is what I did. And I think you guys received an article that I sent out, is that this is how the idea for that work came up, which is that, well, if this part of the brain lights up again and again when people are craving drugs, right, then how do I study how important it is for people? How might I find out? I'm asking you guys. What would be, I'm sorry?
Focusing on that part.
How would I focus on it? What would I do to
Remove it.
remove it? Okay, so how might I remove it in a person?
Kill them.
Okay. That will certainly change their behavior. Okay, yeah, okay.
You can't really get into a brain.
You can't, right? It's hard. It's not like an animal, right? So what you can do is you can find people who have railroad tamping rods shot through their head, or you can look at people who have strokes, right? You guys know what strokes are? Yeah. They're like heart attacks for the brain. You know, like something happens where the blood supply of the brain gets disrupted, and it's not like the whole brain gets disrupted. For example, there's arteries that go right into this area and just feed the insula, right? And some surrounding areas. So what I did was I found a bunch of people who were smoking at some point in their lives, and they were smoking a good amount of cigarettes, and they were fairly addicted to smoking, and then they ended up having strokes in the insula. Okay, and I had the hypothesis that the insula is somehow important for driving people's craving, right? For driving people's ongoing desire to use cigarettes. And so what I did was I said, well, what happens if you have that addiction and then you lose this part of the brain from a stroke, right? Now, if I'm correct that the insula is important for addiction, what will happen if you get a stroke there?
They'll have an easier time keeping away from it.
Yeah, right. So they may have an easier time keeping away from it. They may not be interested in it anymore, right? They may just quit, right? And indeed, that's what happened. So in about, I think about 80% of the people who I studied who had this kind of stroke, they lost an interest in smoking. They seemed to sort of wake up the next day without really any particular interest in smoking, without any desire to smoke anymore, and it was very easy for them to quit. In fact, a couple of people who I looked at seemed to find it all of a sudden disgusting. Even the mere thought of smoking became this gross thing in their mind. And so this sort of proved in a way that this part of the brain is an important area for addiction. And so what was unique about this was that these functional imaging studies, they show a lot of interesting things about, well, this part of the brain lights up and this part of the brain lights up. But just lighting up in a functional imaging study doesn't mean that you actually need something, right, to have that particular behavior. What it just shows you is there's a correlation, right? To know that something you really need it, right, you have to knock it out. And this idea of knocking things out is a central tenet in sort of biological research in general, right? You guys have heard about knockout mice and sort of genes where you take out a gene and all of a sudden the mouse doesn't develop properly, so that's like a lesion. You're taking something out that was there and you're studying what happens when it's not there anymore. And so this is a fundamental approach in neuroscience, and it's a kind of an old school approach to study people with strokes and things like that, because ever since this stuff came around, people have been doing less and less of this kind of research. But I felt like this was really important for this particular question, and so this was the first time that we'd ever used kind of a lesion method to study addiction in people, right? And lo and behold, we found that this part of the brain, which people hadn't really been that interested in anymore, all of a sudden is like, wow, it's like the sort of miracle that people aren't smoking anymore, right? Now, as a result of this, it became a kind of I made this huge splash, right? It was a sort of big deal where, it got on the front page of the New York Times, and I got interviewed on TV, and it was this whole kind of freak out, this sort of sensationalistic thing that everybody was like, well, let's just go in and we'll just knock out this part of the brain and everybody will stop smoking, right? And that's not what I was saying. Okay, that's an implication, but what I was just saying was that, well, let's just start focusing on this part of the brain as an area of study. And since then, other people have actually taken that, they've gone back into animal models, and they've looked at the insula, they've lesioned the insula in animals, and they've shown that indeed that reduces animal models of nicotine and cocaine and alcohol and all these other drugs. And so it's sort of spawned an area of research. And so that was really what I did in my PhD work. Now, I realized throughout this whole time that I wanted to combine my interest in addiction and neuroscience with being a doctor, right? And so, you know, there was a while where I thought, well, you know, people who doctors were interested in the brain are neurologists, right? You guys have heard of neurologists before, right? But there's a whole other kind of brain doctor, if you will, right, which is a psychiatrist, right? Now, you guys probably have heard of psychiatrists before. You know, historically, psychiatrists were interested in things that were what we call the mind, right? Things like memories and emotions and feelings, personality, mood, anxiety, schizophrenia, things like that. Now, historically, people didn't really understand that that had anything to do with the brain. They assumed that it did, but they didn't have the tools to study that. But, you know, in the last 50 years or so, there's been an explosion of what we call biological psychiatry, which is the psychiatry that thinks about the brain and tries to understand the neural basis for things like drug addiction, depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, and all these other disorders. And so I became interested in psychiatry and ultimately decided to specialize in that. And so, you know, in the midst of my medical education, I sort of committed myself to that. And at the end of my MD PhD, I decided to apply to residency programs in psychiatry. And I ended up coming to Columbia University, which is where I am now. And I'm now a fourth-year resident. So I'm actually still in school. Okay? I mean, not really, but, you know, I kind of. I mean, I get paid, which is good, but I'm still training. So this is a long road. And I am at the end of my clinical training at this point. So I'm now, you know, within a month I will be a, you know, board-eligible psychiatrist. I'm going to open a private practice. I'm, you know, all these other things. But I'm also continuing my research work in addiction. And so the project that I'm going to do, that I'm doing now, is a little bit different from this, but still looks at that. It's interested in how do we reduce this craving, right? So this system gets all sort of hot and bothered when we see cues, right? And how can you reduce the activity of these systems, okay? And so there's parts of the brain here, located here in the prefrontal cortex, that seem to have a kind of an inhibitory relationship. Their activity seems to reduce the activity of these craving-related areas. And so when people think about, well, okay, I see somebody smoking in front of me, but if I think about all the bad things that smoking can do to me, right, we actually know now that just by thinking about negative consequences, we can actually tune down the activity of this system, okay? And what happens when that goes on is that these areas, the activity in these areas goes down, while the activity in these areas goes up. So there's some kind of relationship between these areas that are, you know, that the areas, this is a kind of a not very, doesn't make much sense now, it's kind of a mess, but the point is that there are areas that trigger craving, okay, and these include the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, PFC, the amygdala. You guys have heard about the amygdala? The nucleus accumbens, and then the insula, right? And these are areas that trigger craving, and then there's areas that control or regulate craving. Okay, and these include areas like the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Notice that, prefrontal cortex figures heavily in here, and there's some way that these areas kind of put the brakes on these areas, okay? And this happens when you think about negative consequences, when you think about the people who are harmed by using drugs, that somehow doing that turns these brain areas on, and that turns these brain areas off. And so I'm right now using functional MRI to understand how when I show people, and I'm looking at alcohol, when I show people pictures of alcohol or pictures of people drinking, it turns this system on, and then I say, well, now think about all the bad things that alcohol can do to you, and how that then turns the system off, right? And what parts of the brain are more active and what parts of the brain are less active. And so that's the work I'm involved in now. You know, so in the future, what I'll do is sort of continue this. I'm interested in things like how treatments will change this system, right? So imagine that you have a treatment that works, right? A treatment that helps people to stop drinking. How do you think it'll affect the system? how do you think it'll change the functioning of this box? It'll increase it, right. So an effective treatment will increase it. How do you think the effective treatment will affect the functioning of this box? It'll decrease it, right? And then there's some connection in here, right? How do you think it'll affect the strength of that connection? It'll what?
Make it weaker?
Make it weaker? Well, actually it probably will make it stronger because this, well, good guess, good guess. What it'll do is because this control is what the treatment is doing, right? It's actually sort of putting the brakes on. It's like getting stronger brakes, right? So getting the stronger brakes here, it's a little confusing because it's making a negative signal stronger. So it's like more negative. So in a way it's weaker, but it's actually the actual inhibitory control is increasing. All right. So the actual what we call functional connectivity between this system and that system is increasing, right? So I'm interested in saying, well, I'll give you a treatment, and let's see what it does before and after that treatment when we do this. Okay. And that's kind of where I'm headed with my research. And then along with that, I'm interested in just practicing psychiatry and working with people who have depression, anxiety, and substance abuse problems, and helping them to function in their lives. And so that's kind of where I got to where I am now. So hopefully that's been a bit of a sort of tour through addiction neuroscience and different aspects of neuroscience, but also a kind of a sense of how one gets to being a psychiatrist who is a neuroscientist at the same time. But it all starts here. This is kind of where these kinds of things begin. Any questions that you guys have about all this? Yeah.
So when you are treating somebody for their addiction and you change the relationship between those two parts, is it a matter of when trying to keep off whatever they're addicted to, is it a matter of the addiction going away or controlling the environment?
That's a great question. And I think, it's interesting that you put it that way in terms of controlling the environment, because that's one major component of treating addictions. So to answer the first part of your question is that addictions don't go away, right? And that's why they're so scary, right? Is that, early on it seems like, oh, I could just stop this whenever. But at a certain point, you lose control and the addiction takes over. And it's related to learning in the brain, right? So plasticity. Have you guys learned about neural plasticity and memory and things like that? So as you guys know then, that kind of change in the brain can be permanent, right? And in the case of addiction, my view, and other people may disagree, but my view is that these are largely irreversible changes. And that what treatments do is that nothing is ever going to cut this out unless you lesion that part of the brain, right? Which we can't really do in people. Okay, so all the treatments are doing is essentially you can try to reduce this a little bit. You can say, well, the drugs are less attractive. We'll give you medications that reduce their attractiveness, that reduce their reinforcing value. But most treatments that are kind of psychotherapies, they work on this system, right? And they work by helping people to self-regulate, right? Think about, and this is exactly how the treatments work. Think about all the bad things that drinking has done for you. And when you're in a situation that you want to drink alcohol, try to distract yourself, try to remove yourself from that situation. And like you alluded to, change your environment, right? So, don't hang around with those people who are, the ones who you always drink around, right? Because every time you go or hang around them, you're going to start drinking again. That's what happens, right? And so, people may think, oh no, I'll be able to control myself, which is a kind of a denial that people have. But that's what happens again and again and again. So it's both, right? You want to help the person regulate and you want to change their environment, but you're not going to necessarily take this away. And that's why it's better to not become addicted in the first place, because once you become addicted, you'll never go back. You can spend your whole life trying to regulate this system, and people do. People who are in recovery for 20, 30, 40 years, they stop using the drugs, right? And they're doing this all the time. They're going to AA and they're meeting with their sponsor and they're doing this all the time. Once they stop that, and once they have a sip of alcohol, they go right back to this, right? And this thing just fires up as if it was never stopped, right? So the addiction is always there in a kind of a latent form, right? So we have effective treatments. They help people function better because they use less of the drug, but it doesn't mean that this system shuts off entirely or goes away. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Anybody else?
It is the last period of the day, so the sun is out.
Okay. Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.